welcome to our event. I'm very excited for today. We have amazing panelists. Ardita and I will be moderating the entire event. As a quick introduction, my name is Aya. I am the co-president of ANCoRS, which is Columbia University's Negotiation Conflict Resolution Association. Ardita?
Thank you, Aya, for the introduction. My name is Ardita Ropaj. Currently, right now, I work on trade finance at Citibank. I am a Columbia University alumni and really excited to host this panel discussion with Aya and really looking forward to seeing what the panelists have to say.
And our three amazing panelists that are going to introduce themselves. First and foremost is Beth.
Hi, so my name is Beth Fisher-Yoshida. I'm a professor of practice at Columbia University and the academic director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Master's Program, and also Vice Chair of Faculty at the School of Professional Studies.
Thank you for that introduction. We now have Frank.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Frank Samolis. I'm a lawyer, a partner, and co-chair of the International Trade Group at a law firm called Squire, Patton, Boggs. It's a global law firm of over 1,500 lawyers. We have 45 offices in 20 countries around the world, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. And we then have Michael.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Forhez. I'm the Global Managing Director for the Consumer Markets, Retail and Consumer Goods sectors at Oracle Corporation. For those who don't know who Oracle is, it's one of the top 5 most important software companies in the world with 135,000 employees worldwide and annual revenue totaling around $45 billion a year. I travel the globe regularly as part of my duties, and I'm honored and pleased to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much. And just as a quick introduction, we are going to talk about negotiation in many different categories, and I'm just going to list them off to make sure that I don't forget anything. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and its impact on negotiation, post-election, consumer market, global trade, organizational adaptation, and we're also going to talk about any negotiation field advice that our 3 panelists might have. And I'm going to let Ardita take the lead with the first few questions.
Thank you, Aya. So our groups that got together really had some detailed questions they wanted to ask. So we're just going to kick it off. And this is going to be open to all panelists. What does the current flows of critical products into major economies tell us about the sentiment of consumers? What are some implications for future trade and consumer spending flows due to COVID-19? And again, open to all panelists.
Well, maybe I'll lead off being as you brought up consumer products. So as I mentioned earlier, I travel all over the world meeting with some of the largest consumer goods companies. You may know them as Nestle and Procter & Gamble, Unilever and Coca-Cola. What we have seen, obviously, in the last 6 months is extraordinary by any measure. The supply chain organizations, the manufacturing processing, the distribution methodologies that have been the supporting structures of the retail and consumer goods industry for something going on for 100 years have obviously been interrupted as a result of the COVID as well. And not to get into the ultimate political issues of our day, we've had issues of tariffs and trade and so forth, and some of the internecine issues that exist between nation states. So when you throw all that together, complex supply chains that take decades to build, the COVID pandemic, which has interrupted the flow of goods and services, and some of the political structures that support and the decisions that are made between nation states, we find ourselves at a very particular and challenging moment.
This is Frank. I would agree with Michael and his observation. My role as an advisor to private companies is to help them navigate first of all of the tariffs that have been imposed, not only with respect to China, but also steel and aluminum, national security tariffs, the Boeing Airbus dispute. That has created all kinds of complications in terms of supply chains for my clients. And then compounding that, of course, is COVID. So you have a situation where we are advising clients in ongoing trade negotiations as to how they might be able to come up with solutions in the context of a trade agreement or trade legislation, which is another option, to help expedite new supply chains. And that's really, they call it production sharing or co-production. Countries around the world are looking to re-navigate their own supply chains in light of China and companies coming up with a plan B. So it's a very complicated situation, as Michael said, and it's fraught with political overtones as well.
I was going to add that when you have smaller companies, a lot of times they have a little bit more agility and they can respond in the moment more easily than those that are larger, like a large ship. How do you steer a large ship? So in these times of pandemics and everything else happening in the world, it seems like more and more crises could be coming where we have to be able to be agile and pivot and living with that ambiguity in these times.
And I mean, wonderful. As a follow-up, what kind of pivots have you seen ongoing with businesses? You mentioned small businesses. What about multi-continental organizations? What have you seen at that level?
Well, I think there's been clearly a dependency on certain parts of the world, let's say Asia Pacific and China in particular, where raw manufacturing is translated into finished goods. The iPhone, for example, that we have, we don't see the iPhone being manufactured virtually anywhere else in the world. And that's about to change, by the way, but it was some years ago that Steve Jobs literally said that's never coming back to America, that they had found the place to manufacture these things at scale and at a cost per unit that made them possible to have in our hands, right? So, but we are seeing right now some of the challenges imposed by the political structures of the world. And then of course, the COVID has had a huge impact on what were otherwise secure supply chains. So when you throw all that together, it goes to the obvious that manufacturers, whatever they're making, are going to look for second and third and fourth, and who knows how many different locales by which they can actually source raw commodities and manufacture finished goods. And this is already taking place as a result of what's happening by the necessity of the moment.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I was going to add that, yes, so you have raw goods, the different materials, you have the places of manufacturing, and then you have labor. And so the nature of labor and what's required, it has been shifting as well. So for many, many years, we've been an interlinked economy where something happens in one part of the world, it ripples through in other parts of the world. And that goes also to the agility. But traditionally we've had, say, manufacturing labor skills and so on. And now we have the information age and we have a different set of labor skills. We have education that's connected to that. So I think there's going to be a lot more movement that's happening, and places in the world, such as, let's say, Africa, which has been a really big source of raw materials, doesn't have as much of a manufacturing arm, but maybe that's going to change too, where they keep more of the raw materials and develop the skills of manufacturing.
Right, I agree. And I would add to that countries around the world are reacting by coming up with their own programs to attract investment and attract manufacturing. So you look at a country like India or Eastern Europe or Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, all these countries are coming up with a package of incentives to bring these manufacturers we've been talking about into their countries, to give them additional supply source options and to give them other capabilities that they wouldn't otherwise have.
And just going off of that conversation in terms of supply chains, divergence, right? We see this sentiment where it's reflective on consumer spending across various categories. What are some key areas that continue to face downturns and areas that continue to rise in consumer spending due to the COVID-19 and these implications and changes that are ongoing due to this pandemic? And what have you seen? And again, this is open as a follow-up to all panelists.
Well, I don't think there's any secret, right? We're all reading it in the news and experiencing it in our daily lives. So, travel, transportation, and hospitality. If you're going to a restaurant, you have to go in conditions that looked vastly different a year ago. I used to live in Manhattan, and I watch and talk to my friends who are there right now. But I'm not right now, and I happen to be in London, going to any restaurant, and I don't intend to go to any restaurant, speaking personally, until we're through the other side of this. in entertainment venues, right? So if you were going to sports stadiums or if you were going to concerts, that's all off the table right now and for the foreseeable future. If you're going on vacations, you may, if you've got the financial means, be able to find a venue that's relatively or almost entirely private. But I can guarantee you, you're probably not going to Disneyland or Disney World, and that's a shame, obviously, if you've got kids. But those institutions, those corporations, those entities are going to have to adjust right now their economic models to take into account, the length of time that this is likely to take, and then what it's going to take to have to rebuild their businesses once we come out the other side. Finally, and to the point about what is an upturn, that's also very interesting because in as much as we're spending more time at home, self-catering, so grocery stores are selling more units of product per category than was the case this time a year ago because we're not going to restaurants. And again, if you have some discretionary income, you're seeing people buying sofas, buying consumer electronics, doing some landscaping on their properties because, well, what are they doing? They're spending more time at home. So they're, if you will, feathering their nest to make life possible in a way that, they have to count on because that's their one area of respite.
As a follow-up, what sort of regulations have you seen that are stimulating this and are stimulating some of the trade flows that are ongoing in regards to a lot of these consumer products? And this is directed to Michael.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, well, product transparency has been an ongoing issue for some time. In the words of the once CMO of Target, it's about everything around you, everything that goes on you, everything that goes inside of you. And so as consumers, we have access to a vast array of information about the ingredients that are in the things that we buy for consumption, or as those things are produced, whether they're hard goods or soft goods. And therefore, we are making decisions based on the efficacy, the utilization, the impact on the environment, and so forth. And with that, are coming more stringent regimes, regulations from various parts of the world. In the European theater, it's known as EU 1169 that requires manufacturers to provide this information readily to the consumer. In the United States, we have something called the Smart Label, where you can scan a product with your iPhone and obtain characteristics of that product down to anywhere from 150 to 250 individual product attributes. So what you're seeing now is a degree of transparency required to support trust in the products that we buy and belief that what we're buying is not bad for the environment, bad for us personally. And I think that's actually a very positive shift.
So going off of that, one of the questions that a lot of students have sent is actually they want to know how has COVID influenced your approaches toward negotiation and dealing with conflict? And this question is open to all the panelists, but specifically they want to understand what sort of business adaptations have you seen in global business make, and have they been proved to be successful in specific industries? Sorry. And again, that question is open to everyone.
Well, I think you're seeing an interest in what they call regulatory coherence, good regulatory practices. That's something Michael alluded to, but it comes up again and again in the context of bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations. So when the US and the EU are talking, or the US and the UK are talking about a trade agreement, one of the major elements now is having a cohesive set of regulations, good regulatory practices that don't diverge from one another, and therefore provide a wider opportunity for consumers at a much more transparent mechanism.
I think also that there's a lot more caution on the part of everybody because of the big health risks that we're facing. So for example, for the first couple of months of the year, when we didn't know much about what COVID was and everybody was just very fearful about things, there was a slowdown, everything sort of stopped. And then once things started picking back up again, for better or worse, because we've had different waves of COVID reappearing, then all the manufacturing, supply chains, manufacturing have been slowed down. So there are incredible delays, in addition to the fact that travel has been curtailed, as was mentioned. So then the interpersonal relationships that you have in your negotiations have changed, because you don't have a chance to go out with somebody for a drink or dinner. You have to do everything virtually now. And so that has a little bit of an effect. And so depending on your cultural orientation, some people adapt more easily to doing what they need to do virtually than others. It goes by culture, national culture. It also goes by generation and how comfortable you are in this virtual online space. So it's definitely impacted negotiations for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree with Beth. I think the U.S. Trade Representative, which has authority for negotiating these trade agreements, is used to face-to-face negotiations. And there is an exchange of offers and texts. It's all very personal and one-on-one or with a group. So everybody is having to get used to this new method of negotiation, which is what we're doing now by Zoom and virtual. And it takes away a lot from the interpersonal dynamics, being able to read a person and understand what it is that's achievable and what's not. Very challenging.
Yeah, and if I just might add to that for a minute, Frank, and I brought up I used the word transparency with respect to the products that we buy and use, but I think also transparency in multilateral negotiations. I mean, it used to be that many of these decisions were made in, if you will, back rooms between negotiating partners and between governments whose stake and interest may not have been visible to any of us. And now, you know, with the multilateral commission, with Davos and so forth, I mean, people want to know where their governments stand. People want to know what those governments' policies will be and what the impact will be on their countries and on international relations and on economic models. In a global economy now, it's very, very clear the degree to which understanding that and having the buy-in of the citizens that are governed by these structures is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we will see an undoing. And I think we do see that in certain parts of the world where that transparency is not in evidence.
And just to build off of that, you know, this relationship between Chinese manufacturers and American buyers, what kind of shifts and shifts have you seen through this pandemic, and what kind of negotiation strategies and adaptations have you witnessed in your current career and your current role?
I'm going to talk about the impact on universities, for example. And so in the United States, there's a tremendous population of international students that have been coming over the years, and that's only been increasing, with a large number coming from China. And so now, with the embassies being closed and visas not being processed, and the regulations about whether or not students can be on campus has shifted all of that. And there's a different attitude or respect towards online learning, depending on the culture. And in general, it's not as accepted in the Chinese context. I am overgeneralizing, but financially, that's a very big impact on universities when you lose a big source of your student population. So that's really affecting a lot about what's happening. And it's even affecting for next semester and what's happening with deferrals. Tremendous amount of deferrals happening. And if you are budgeting that into your budget and expecting that kind of tuition to come in, and it's not, that just continues to be a delay. And also with facilities, that we're not using facilities to host events and things. So that's a big drain. So and universities have been facing a lot of financial challenges in these times.
Yeah, I would add that there's also a complication driven by politics, particularly in the United States. Ardita, you talk about China. Remember, we now have a phase 1 agreement under the Trump administration that is kind of in limbo right now. President-elect Biden said, I think it was just yesterday, that he did not intend to revisit those tariffs anytime soon until he takes care of the domestic economy. But that's one huge example of how COVID is affecting trade negotiations, and it's compounded by the U.S. government transition to a new administration and what this new president will do on trade talks, number one being China.
And just to build off of that, in terms of the context, how have previous trade agreements and consumer habits contributed to the shortages during this pandemic? You mentioned these shifts are ongoing, and the new administration is obviously going to look at this domestically, internationally. But what have you seen as previous implications? Directed to Frank.
Well, the previous negotiations, there's always been a concern about what they call SPS issues, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Those are built into the agreements. I have represented countries in negotiating free trade agreements with the US. I represented Colombia and Peru and Korea. And I've seen that over and over again in terms of making sure that you have an open supply chain. Now, obviously, those agreements were negotiated and finalized long before COVID. So the question is, what modifications are countries willing to make to allow more access to COVID-related medical items and treatment issues? And those are ongoing on an individual bilateral basis.
Yeah, and I might add, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Even with globalization as we thought it took hold, as we created within the business realms and within other economic realms, these models. Beth, you were talking about student exchanges. My wife is actually a professor at Duke University, and we saw the impact of the challenges for international students. So I'm well aware of that challenge as well. In the business world, the exchange of money, of intellectual property, of technical know-how and what have you, all of these things are on the line right now. And so, the very model of globalization, which was balanced on a win-win, I can make something more efficiently here. You need a lot more of it there. I have something in exchange for what you have that I need. And so we have worked out this regime, if you will. And what's, I think, been laid bare is the degree of its, if you will, not so much its flexibility, but the degree to which it was so highly interdependent, almost to make it almost inflexible. It turns out that it's actually more fragile than we might have imagined. Now, what's fascinating is the degree of adaptation that's taking hold, and that shouldn't be surprising because lives are on the line. But what we see now is the connective tissue between economics of one country and another, one region and another, one manufacturer and another supplier, or the supplier's supplier to make that product possible. All of these things now hang in the balance almost by a thread.
And just building off that, globalization, supply chains, and we've got now this fragility of these supply chains. Why is it that we really could not buy toilet paper during this pandemic?
I suppose because I'm in the consumer product sector, you're directing at me, and I don't want to hog the space, but I'll try to answer that question as succinctly as possible. The best way to answer that question is to ask a question. Why does that happen when we have a snowstorm or there's the anticipation of a hurricane in Florida, right? And toilet paper is a particularly interesting commodity. Well, I guess it goes to sentiment in the most obvious, right? If I don't want to be without anything, I don't want to be without toilet paper. But the truth is, this has been going along for a long time, whether it's milk, bread and butter. Oh, everybody rushes to the grocery store like it's going to be an apocalypse, like we're going to run out of something. Now, what's different today, of course, is that a global pandemic doesn't have a climate control moment. It doesn't, which is kind of passing through time. The storm comes and it goes. It's not a regional thing per se. In Boston, it's going to be there's a snowstorm, but in Florida, it's sunny as can be, right? This is pan-global. And so the impact is felt and the panic is felt. And so the bottom line is, this is about hoarding, and it's about behavior, and it's about emotion. And what I'd suggest, and what I have been suggesting to major manufacturers and retailers, is to engage in a more authentic conversation with shoppers, to give them some relief, to let them know that, okay, we may look like we're out of something today, but if you'd come back tomorrow, it's not a problem. There's plenty. You don't have to freak out, And if really you are short on toilet paper, don't worry. I've got enough in the back room. Just have a conversation and we'll give you a couple rolls to get you through the day. we are going to have to adjust for the next 6 to 12 months our behavior in order to ensure that every one of us gets the things that we need. If we do that, it's not a fait accompli. It's not a closed loop. And I think that accurate communication about the products that are available, the services that I can provide to you, that these things are there, that we don't have to panic. This is the kind of thing that we need to have a conversation about.
Building on what Michael was saying about behavior and consumer behavior and attitudes, a lot of it has to do with our psychological state. So there's tremendous amount of fear. Fear is governing everybody. So remember that earlier when this pandemic was first spreading, we didn't know if it was carried on surfaces. So everybody was just getting all the PPE gear in place. And it was like taking your life in your hands to go to a supermarket to even buy groceries. So the whole fear was really there. And so then we felt in general, like as societies, that maybe there was a lack of trust in what was being communicated. And then of course, with the 24/7 news cycle that you just keep watching the same thing. And because of wanting to have viewership, then it's the worst case scenario, and it plays over and over and over, which only increases the fear, which then makes people get very territorial and thinking, I'm going to hoard what I need to hoard to protect myself and my loved ones. And so that was something that was very much in operation.
It's the paradox of the digital age, isn't it, Beth? I mean, the more information we have, the more informed we think we are, but that information is moving at light speed, and our ability to digest it, to make sense of it, to even know that it's trustworthy to begin with, all of these things fuel that sense of a lack of control. And I think people are reacting just as you suggested as a result.
In addition to some intentional messaging coming out that you can't believe what you hear and you can't believe what you read, and then people say, well, what do I do? And so all of that confusion just fosters more fear.
I would agree.
In terms of trade, and supply chains, Frank, if you wanted to add, on this question, why no toilet paper in the stores in the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, I would have to agree with Michael and Beth. Most of it is human panic and human acting in somewhat irrational fashion, just like the snowstorm that Michael talked about. So at the beginning, people didn't know how long this was going to last, and there was a rush to the grocery stores. I don't think it had anything to do with supply chains or trade. I think it had to do with human emotions and reacting to the unknown. And complicating that is the fact that we're getting different advice from the governments in charge. You look at the CDC, just yesterday changed the quarantine days. So there's an ongoing shift in the way the government is advising us to respond. Wear the mask outside all the time. Now you don't have to quarantine it so long. So it's evolving. Unlike a snowstorm, I guess, there's no real end in sight. It's not going to end in a couple of days. And everybody's trying to react in a certain way that protects their own interests, including consumer interests.
And just to pivot slightly, there's been a serious engagement at the World Trade Organization level, which has implications for these supply chains and these trade flows. In terms of trade agreements, in terms of common grounds and these new agreements that are coming in, what are some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on these negotiation strategies that are being taken on by these nation states as they try to acquire some of these products such as vaccines? And what have you seen in terms of, the implication that the World Trade Organization and the new negotiation strategies that are ongoing through this process?
Well, a couple of points. Number one, I think the WTO has certainly recognized the urgency of addressing this issue in terms of increased market access. But the bigger question is the future of the WTO, even beyond COVID. All of these bilateral and multilateral trade agreements we've been reading about are technically illegal under the WTO. You're not supposed to be entering into agreements that exclude other countries. Now, there's a way to get waivers and everything else, but the point is, ever since the last round, the Doha round back in 2000 failed, the WTO has been completely powerless as far as an institution to resolve issues on a multilateral basis. So we're looking to come up with the next best thing. Now, the Trump administration didn't help that by taking a very negative attitude toward multilateral talks and to the WTO in particular by holding up the appointment of appellate judges and other things. But I think with the Biden administration, there's certainly going to be more appetite for multilateral engagement. And on top of that, the WTO itself is going through a major change. They have been going through an election for the new Director General. It's down to 2 people now, 2 women. So I think no matter who prevails, there will be some new blood in the WTO, a new willingness to possibly restart multilateral negotiations. So that's where I think there's some hope in terms of the WTO taking on more relevance, not only with respect to COVID, but with respect to renewing multilateral trade negotiations.
And just as a follow-up, could you maybe talk a bit more as to what the Biden administration will mean for global trade?
Sure. As I mentioned, the first point is that trade is not an immediate priority for the Biden administration. And I mentioned the comment he made, I think just yesterday, saying he was not in any rush to revisit the China tariffs or the 232 tariffs. But in the long term, I think we will have a more nuanced approach. We will have an approach that is not, I hate to use the cliche transactional approach of the Trump administration, but Biden clearly understands the geopolitical implications and importance of trade. So he will view trade as part of a broader geopolitical strategy. And, he will not be caving into China. I think he's going to try and extract whatever concessions he can to, if he's going to eliminate or reduce those tariffs. But he'll have more structure. He'll have a more strategic view. He'll probably resurrect the old strategic and economic dialogue that the Obama administration had. So he will engage in a lot of things that will make us more multilaterally engaged and not so much bilaterally.
I was going to add that if you think about, so over the years, the world has become much more interdependent all across the board with supply chains and manufacturing and products and accessibility and labor. People have moved as well. And then the past, what is it, like 6 years or so, there's been a big wave of populist movement around the world. And the populist movement has caused a lot of countries to want to be more insular and to be more isolationist, which sent a lot of a ripple effect around, because now people are saying, well, what's going to happen? What does this mean for us? And where are the alliances and where are they not? And now we're starting to see a shift somewhere else. So people are starting to say, Brexit, how do we agree to that? What went on? But at that moment, when there was an agreement on it, and now they're trying to carry through and all the complications that are happening with that. And now we have a shift in the political climate here in the US as well. So it's really to see what's going to happen going forward about how we review and then re-engage with our partners around the world.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I think Beth raises a very good point in terms of populism. That affects us in the United States. Remember, the legal authority for approving trade agreements is something called Trade Promotion Authority. That authority expires in the middle of next year. And there really, I don't think, is an appetite in Congress, either among Democrats or Republicans, to engage in open-ended trade agreements and giving the president that authority. So my prediction is, if that authority is extended, it'll be extended on a case-by-case basis. So maybe he'll do it just for US-UK talks. And Congress will just give it a very limited approval. But that reflects this notion of populism that Beth referred to. It's very widespread and affects the US.
So my next question actually really matches very well with what you guys just said. And it's about what difficult conversations have arisen due to the financial and political climate, and how do these impact negotiations and planning? And this question is, well, first to Beth, but then please feel free to jump in, Frank and Michael.
So when you're talking about difficult conversations, do you mean on a political level, and which level are we talking about? Because they're kind of all over the place. So if we just look more like what's happening in the US, which did prompt a lot of other things to happen around the world, was the whole idea about what happened in May when George Floyd was killed. So a lot of race conversations were coming up. And it had been rumbling under the surface for quite a bit of time, as we know, but now it's sort of risen in a way that I think it's not going back under the carpet. It's not going to be swept away so easily, which really prompted, it sparked demonstrations and reactions around the world where people were looking at what was happening in the US and people were looking at what was happening in their own situations, which once again demonstrates on so many levels how we're linked together. If you think about the internet and communication and the popularity of different kinds of media forms and different kinds of products around the world, we're very much interlinked. So a ripple effect goes around and around on multiple levels, not only on consumer goods and consumer purchasing, but really the whole idea about power and distribution of resources and so on. Those are conversations that I think are not going away. They're difficult conversations because we're going to have to think about potentially redistribution of wealth, which is very scary for some people. And I think those are the kind of conversations that are going to be happening more and more.
And just to build off of that, in terms of immigration, we've seen influx and disputes that are ongoing. What are your thoughts on immigration policy as it pertains to employment in the hospitality and the food sector? How does the average American feel this affects their daily lives? And what are the implications that you've seen because of the pandemic? And this is open to all panelists with a skewed view towards Michael, just because of your background.
All right, well, I'll just lead off by posing this in almost macro terms. I mean, immigration policy is derived through, a combination of national requirements and interests, international relations and understandings, economic perceptions and realities, and of course, political considerations and calculations. All of these we're concerned with. All of these are considered with various weightings, if you will, for rationalizing how many might be permitted to work in the United States, full-time, for a period of time, for granting green cards, and even for citizenship. As we're here discussing negotiation as a way to achieve our aims, in this case on a national basis, I think this is a great question. I've been thinking about it quite a bit, actually, in conversations I've been having with executives for a while now because of workforce concentrations and again, intellectual capital exchange and what have you. So there are macro issues here, and then the broader impact for human beings, that they can come to where they want to be, whether it's coming to the United States for a period of time or visiting any other part of the world for that matter. I happen to believe that America, any country, is bettered by the greatest cross-section of thinking. And whether that's in the arts and sciences or in business or what have you, that we benefit from others by having different points of view. I think that's both a socially useful thing and an economically viable rationale. And so I'm for immigration in its various forms. And I'm hoping that, in the years to come, the world will open up, that we might get past some of the, if you will, xenophobia or some of the nationalistic behaviors that have given rise to rethinking why and how people might be able to move around and share in this thing called Earth.
Yeah, I would agree. I think historically, trade agreements have always been kept separate from immigration policy. And I know in my experience of advising countries who wanted to get more access for people coming into the US, hard position of the US was that this is separate from a trade agreement. But things are changing, and I think in the right direction. I think there's now a greater willingness to take a holistic view that trade can't exclude immigration and it can't exclude labor. Labor is an important, and the movement of labor is an important part of agreements. So part of what the WTO is looking to do in the future is to include that in its topics of either a multilateral or a plurilateral agreement, which would not include all countries. So I agree with Michael. I think the trend is going in the right direction. Hopefully in the US, we've gotten over the xenophobia and people are willing to revisit the issue as a matter of national importance and legislation.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, building on what my colleagues have said here, if you think about it in terms of resources and think about learning, then we are missing so much by not being able to learn from others because they can't get a visa to be here with us. And when I think about even the alumni network around the world from this university, that we would be able to have smaller clusters of gathering if people who are around the world could actually be local with other people. but there are different kinds of employment regulations that hold us back. And so very often I want to be able to have somebody come into the program, or somebody come in and present something or do something or teach something, and then I'm limited because of visa restrictions there. And I feel that we're all missing out by that happening. And so sometimes in a very idealistic way, I think, well, why do we even need to have this thing called visas? Why can't there be a freer flow of people around the world? I think that may be a little radical, and maybe people would be fearful that everybody would flood into a particular place. But when you think about now, because of the pandemic, one thing that's come out is everybody is rethinking the world of virtual work. Can we learn in an educational context virtually? Can we conduct business virtually? So there's a different way of sort of acclimating to that world. And maybe people will say, well, you know what, if I can be virtual, why don't I live in a place that has much better weather than where I'm living? Because there are many places that we live for other kinds of things, but definitely not for the climate, right? So you're talking way earlier about different kind of consumer goods. And I was thinking, okay, restaurants. So if you're in a cold climate, you are limited, and maybe the restaurant goes out of business because they can't have people come inside when restrictions shut them down. But if you're in a warmer climate where there's a lot of indoor outdoor living, the restaurants can just expand their seating area and they can stay in business. So all of that's going to impact also how we are movement and virtual and so on.
And just to build off this virtual landscape that's ongoing due to the pandemic, what are some new negotiation strategies you have seen in the consumer markets, global trade, and organizational level due in majority to the political landscape and remote work that's ongoing and being promoted? And this is open to all panelists.
I would say, speaking for the retail and consumer goods sector, again, we call ourselves, that is, suppliers and retailers, trading partners. We call ourselves trading partners for a reason, because explicitly we can't exist one without the other. And actually that's been the case for quite some time. The interdependency of, for supplier, manufacturer, and retailer merchant. Now what's happened, and it was happening before the pandemic, because of a digital age, it's now possible for us as shoppers, consumers, to buy whatever we want, whenever we want, from whomever we want, at any price we're willing to pay, taking possession of it at the time of our choosing. I don't have to go to a store anymore. I was doing that before the pandemic, and the pandemic actually has accelerated this process for reimagining what it means to serve. It is possible now, as a supplier, a manufacturer of razor blades, to just sell my product directly. The Dollar Shave Club was created by a 20-something guy who figured out that a subscription model for razor blades was actually a pretty smart idea. And that caught, if you will, Procter & Gamble, the owner of Gillette, by surprise, because Procter thought it was in the business of making razor blades versus being in the business of creating a positive shaving experience. And what does that mean for negotiation? Well, it means that as trading partners, I have to realize that just making a thing is not enough to sustain me. And just selling a thing isn't, as a retailer, enough to sustain me. The ultimate quest is in the fulfillment of need states, that is, of consumers, shoppers, human beings. What do they want? When do they want it? How do they want it? For what purpose? That is the future of consumerism, and by virtue, the negotiation conversation that takes place between trading partners and consumers buying from supplier or retailer now is being thrown into an entirely new age, and requirements for discipline to go with it.
Yeah, and I would add, from a political standpoint, at least from the US side, with a Biden administration, I think in trade negotiations, there will be, as there typically is with the Democratic president, much higher priority on labor and environmental concerns in any trade agreement. You're already seeing that with Biden re-engaging with the Paris Agreement on climate change. That will be reflected in individual agreements, and it will show the importance that the administration, a Democratic administration, puts on labor and environment, certainly more so than the Trump administration. And we have that to, I think, anticipate, certainly for the next 4 years.
That also affects then, where people look for jobs, where they look for employment. The nature of employment has been changing along with all of these other factors. And so when people decide, should I go back to school? Should I get an education? What do I do after my education? Where do I look for work? Then really thinking about how to talk about the skill set that you have and not just the industry or the discipline, because you're going to have to think about that agility and being able to pivot across the board. So if there is, for example, a heavier focus on environmental orientation, then those are the kinds of green jobs that are probably going to grow more than not. Or if you're thinking about different kind of supply chain fulfillment, then where is that going to grow? Or technology. So it's a whole other way of thinking about the future of work, if we want to talk about that, the future of employment, which goes back to the labor conversation we were having.
Yeah, that is a very astute notion, Beth. Now I happen to be, I don't have an employment contract, but there's a difference between, punching in and just, and not, just, depending on your employment agreements. I can work virtually from anywhere in the world. We're on Zoom right now. 3 years ago, we weren't thinking about doing this kind of communication. We would show up at a summit, at a conference, Davos or wherever, to exchange our views for those who were able to travel. Now, the conversation is across time zones. I happen to be in London right now as I speak with all of you. So we can be, as you put it, anywhere we wish if we're in a position to do that. Now, if you happen to work in a protein plant and you're processing protein, well, guess what? That's where the work is until or if your labor is no longer necessary because automation takes hold. So there are technologies that are changing how we exchange information. That's what we're doing right now, the way we're doing it in Zoom. There are technologies that are automating the process of manufacturing, which, in an earlier day, centuries ago, there were Luddites that actually resisted this because they saw that, oh my gosh, I'm going to be out of work because there's a loom now. If I was a scribe, you don't need a scribe anymore because guess what? We have printing presses. And in every era, we have new technology that causes us to rethink the processes by which we show up and make a difference in the world in which we work, in the world in which we play, in the world in which we consume. All of that is happening now at such an accelerated pace, at speed, almost beyond imagination. What would have taken decades just a while ago is now going to happen in a matter of years. What would have taken years just a year ago is going to happen in a matter of months. It's going to be breathtaking, the change that's going to take hold over the next several years alone.
Well, I wanted to thank each of you for this discussion on consumer markets, global trade, and organizational negotiations. To lead into just negotiation and that field and what students want to ask, I'm going to let Aya take that over. And Aya, if you want to hand that off.
Yes, thank you. And again, thank you all so much. It was incredibly insightful, personally speaking. This conversation is just a bit going to shift. We're going to talk about negotiation and any field advice that you might have. The first question that I have is, when did you realize that you were a negotiator?
Well, from my own experience, I knew I wanted to get into international affairs from an early age. So I enrolled in the Foreign Service School at Georgetown, which probably was the beginning of my exposure to international affairs broadly. And then from there, I went to Georgetown Law School and then worked part-time on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress who then became the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee. So it's not that I had a grand plan to do all that, and I wish I could say I had that much foresight, but I sort of fell into a very unique position. And, this was back at a time when trade was just beginning to explode on a multilateral basis. It was really Japan trade more so than China. China wasn't even a factor. So, and then in terms of going to a law firm, I found myself more and more dealing with clients and with sovereign governments who then wanted to utilize my experience in Congress and elsewhere in helping to negotiate free trade agreements. So I wish I could give you a clearer roadmap, but for me, it was more serendipity than anything else.
I think it's called many different things, right? And there are the formal processes of negotiation, and then there are the everyday processes. You can think about, like when I was a little kid, I was always negotiating. I didn't really respect or like authority, which probably is still the case. So if I was told what to do, I would challenge that and I would negotiate a different process or outcome. But then once I did live in Japan for quite a while. And so the whole idea of intercultural communication or negotiating differences across culture, but it still wasn't a formal process. And then when I worked for a management consulting firm, then it became a little bit more formalized. There was a thing called negotiation. So then instead of just doing it as tacit knowledge, I took a step back and looked at what the process was, which then translated into my being able to study it and teach it and run a program on it. So it was first inside until I had to take that third party perspective, looking at it from outside.
Yeah, I like that, Beth. I think it's fair to say before we come into our varying degrees of consciousness about who we are and the roles that we play in life, we are negotiating. I mean, when you're a kid and you scream out to mom or dad, this is what I want. Well, you're negotiating, you know, and then you realize at some point, well, screaming ain't going to work anymore. I'm going to actually have to have a calm conversation. And then that's not even enough. I actually have to think tactically and strategically, who am I up against in this? And then we start to figure out, well, maybe I'm not against anybody. Maybe it's possible that you can have what you want and I can have what I want, and both of us having what we want is actually a pretty good thing. I was 23 years old when I started my career in business, and I began at Revlon as I was youngest district manager at the time, and they were tutoring me on the field, the marketplace, and so I was sent out on for 2 weeks and calling on beauty salons. And I walked into the beauty salon one day. It was the very first day in my job, and I thought I was selling this great product to the salon owner, when I realized that the woman who was sitting in the salon chair was actually the customer too. And then if I didn't pay attention to her at the cost of thinking that the primary buyer was my only quarry, I was making a terrible mistake. So I had to focus time and attention on her customer. That's when I realized that negotiation wasn't just one directional. It could have multi players involved. And it wasn't about what I wanted, it was about what she wanted and what she wanted. When I realized that, that's when I became a professional, that very day.
And so that actually matches very well with my next question, is how do you train yourself or your team for negotiations? And again, open to all panelists.
Well, I think in terms of representing a sovereign government, to prepare them, the first thing you have to do is really meet at length with the other country's representatives, whether it's the ambassador or their trade counselor or the capital, and get a really good understanding of what their priorities are, what their objectives are, what their strategy is. And then our job is to give them a little bit of a reality check in terms of what's, in our view, achievable from the US side, and politically what would be acceptable. So a lot of countries come in with high hopes on a number of different areas. And sometimes we have to be the bearer of bad news to say, if you're looking for an ultimate agreement, as we've been talking about, negotiation is give and take, whether you're 4 years old or 40 years old. So it's getting the best understanding you can of a country's objectives. I prepare my economists and associates to really understand the economy of that country, the society of that country, what they expect, and then proceed on kind of a gradual basis interacting with the US government.
And so going on what you just said, how would you say the negotiation field has changed in the past 5 years?
Well, Frank, you're a lawyer and you have a very different view on this. Beth, you're an instructor, and so you're working through the academy. Myself, in the business world, when I started out, we were working almost on zero sum, you know, and there were winners and there were losers, and there was degrees of winning and degrees of losing, to which I was trying to focus my attention to get the most I could out of that conversation. We've evolved a bit. Which is to say win-win. And if anybody knows anything about game theory and what have you, we understand the implications of giving up something to get something. I think today in the complex world in which we live, I have made it my strategy to, first to seek to understand, then to be understood, first to seek to serve, that I might be around tomorrow to do exactly that. And those have been the precepts upon which my career has rested for the last decade at least, and by which I advise the people that work with and for me to think hard about as they proceed through their negotiations.
I want to build on that with I think 3 points. So one is that you were talking about, figuring out what the other party needs. So that would be really about the relationship. And I know that happens in the business world and political or whatever it is. And so now being virtual, we're changing the dynamics and the nature of the relationship, right? So that's the relation part. Second thing I was going to say is that, and we teach this in the program, and I do this when I work in organizations and so on, it's really about self-awareness, is that you need to know what you're bringing to the table, and you need to know, we think that we're clever and that we hide things, but sometimes we're really a lot more transparent than we think, and we give things away by little expressions and mannerisms and how we say what we're saying. So really knowing what you want, what the value is for you, and really being able to assert yourself there. And then the third part would be reputation. If you talk about the zero-sum game, you go into a situation and you burn your bridges, you burn your relationship, because the next time around, what's going to happen is people go, oh, watch out for this guy because I was with him once before. And people carry all that emotional baggage with them to the next negotiation. So your reputation, there are some cultures in the world that say, we don't want a signed contract. My word is everything. And if you can't give me your word, I mean, not in the super multi-million-dollar things, but if you can't give me your word and I need to have a signed piece of paper, then I don't trust you. So reputation is so incredibly important and challenging. So it's the self-awareness, the relationship, and then your reputation that you have to go on.
Excellent. I would agree with that, Beth.
And so my next question actually works very well with what Beth just said. What's the best advice you've heard in terms of preparing for negotiation?
Prepare. I always say that so many people say, I think I know enough about this. And I'm like, winging it is not a strategy. So I don't know, but I think you cannot prepare enough for a negotiation. And I know that many people do not prepare. There was somebody I know who did his doctoral research on looking at the average amount of time that people prepare for negotiations, like serious multi-million-dollar deals. And it was like unbelievable fraction, just like a few minutes. And when you think about that, that's really not a good idea. So I would say the best thing to do in preparation is actually prepare.
Right. I would agree. You remind me, Beth, of the maxim that Jim Baker used to have, the former Secretary of State, White House Chief of Staff, Treasury Secretary, and he called it the 5 Ps. And it is prior preparation prevents poor performance. And that's what he lived by. He never took anything for granted. Every discussion, every talk was something he didn't go into by the seat of his pants. He was a well-trained lawyer. He had incredible political instincts. But even with all that, he took the time, each and every discussion, each and every set of negotiations, to be prepared. And it's an easy thing to slough off sometimes and to say, well, this meeting probably isn't all that important. You've got to take everything seriously. And it takes a lot of homework, and as Beth said, a lot of preparation. So I would agree, that's probably the #1 piece of advice that I would give.
Yeah, and if I can build on both of those, then the paradox of preparation is it presumes that I can know everything, and you cannot. We can't know everything. So the more immersion that we have in the situation, what we call situational analysis in my world, and I presume in both of yours as well, is something that we have to pay attention to as well. Who is I won't call them my opponent, my opposite at core. What are their needs as we distinguish them, their needs versus their wants? Okay, what can they live with as an example? Not just about the terms, because most negotiations come with terms, right? Some of them are implicit, some of them are explicit, some of them are in contracts, some of them are just by a handshake or a nod or a glance, right? But, not just about the terms that we agree on, but the trust that we build with on the relationship. I mean, these are at core as well in terms of the negotiation. I may not trust you, but I know I'm going to have to live with you, or I might want to trust you, and vice versa. I think, Beth, you were talking about something that goes to this. What is trust? What is transparency? And how do I earn the right to both? And those are core also, I think, for effective communication and negotiation.
And so my last question before I open it up to the viewers, which is open to all and which I think will conclude quite well that session, is what has helped you get to where you are, and what advice would you have for people that want to follow a similar path?
Well, I've been lucky to have great mentors as I've grown in my career, and I think it's an obligation for young professionals to seek out mentors, whether it's in university, graduate school, beginning your career, wherever you go, there are mentors who are willing to help and willing to guide you. All you have to do is ask. And I find that a lot of times young people beginning their career, maybe it's through a lack of confidence or overconfidence or whatever it is, they have a tremendous resource of people that can provide real guidance as they begin their career. And when I started on Capitol Hill can be a very dangerous and unpredictable place, but you find people. I had a member of Congress who was very helpful, and staff. You find people who can help you. You rely on them. You stay in touch with them. It's an easy thing for a young professional just to have one conversation and leave it go. But I would say you need to keep that engagement going. Go back to people you've talked with in the past. Even if you change careers, they can give you advice. They know you. They know what your interests are and your capabilities. So I would put that number one.
Thank you so much. That's an amazing answer. Beth and Michael?
I was going to say also, in addition to that, I do think that the mentoring, networking is really critical, is to get involved. I know that in my career, I've always been involved in professional organizations of one type or another. I volunteered my services. I try to take on leadership roles, all of it because I wanted to continue learning, which facilitates the networking. And you can't always just expect people to do things for you or to give. You have to give. So if you give and serve, and they would, networking tips like, if you see an article that you think somebody might like, send it to them. Well, yeah, send it to them because, I was thinking about you and I remember you said something about X, and here I found this as a resource. You might really like that. Or like even now I serve on boards and I serve on volunteer boards because it's the whole idea about giving service. And I don't do it quid pro quo, or I do it because I want something in return. I do it because I think it's the right thing to do and to help professional organizations. And then eventually you get back as well.
Yeah, I like that, Beth. A friend of mine told me some years ago, a giving hand is always full. And I think that that's very true. And Frank, to your point about mentorship, when you're very young, you don't realize the degree to which a mentor, you don't realize until many years later, probably, you will look back, I guarantee you in 15, 20, 30 years, you will look back and you will say, that person didn't just make me, that person inspired me. And you will never forget that person. And if you can remember that now, if I give any advice to anybody when they're in their early start in their careers, try to keep in mind generosity of spirit. And by the way, I agree with you, Frank, but I also think that the mentor-protege relationship it's a choice between parties, and you have to earn that on both sides. Mentors know this, right? They seek out proteges because they want to give something of themselves, because they remember at one point when they were fresh, when they were new, when they didn't know very much, and they saw spirit in me. My first boss, he said, that guy, he's got energy. I want to see him succeed. And before you know it, the two of you are enraptured. You're so in sync with each other. I'm getting something that he's got. He's giving something that he wants to pay forward, if you will. So I think, and then the last thing I would add is that remain inquisitive. Seek out big ideas. Don't be beholden to the past. Be inspired yourself. Test your thesis. Penetrate the conversation. Ask people for support. People that you trust. Tell them, I've got a big idea. What do you think about this? And really listen, because they're going to want to contribute. So remember to be aspirational and to be appreciative of those who have been contributing to you, and also be generous in spirit with others that are coming up around you and behind you and even in front of you.
Thank you all three for these amazing answers. I'm sure that our viewers are very excited to hear your insights. I'm now going to let Ardita take over for the questions that we are receiving from the people currently looking at this panel. Ardita?
Thank you, Aya, and thank you, Frank, Beth, and Michael for your diligence and your insights. Just to open it up to our audience, a question that just came in is, do you think that economy and immigration laws would improve or worsen or change due to the new administration?
Well, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I think things will improve simply because at bottom, Biden and his administration is going to be more engaged on a multilateral basis. I'm a big believer in international institutions, whether it's the WTO, the UN, the financial institutions. All of them have a role to play. And the U.S. has to get beyond its own egocentric notions of it can solve everything on its own. We can't. And when you're talking about a long-term strategy with China, we're not going to have success by going it alone. We're not going to have success with trade agreements by judging them as to whether or not we're running a deficit or a surplus. That's really kind of an absurd test, a litmus test. And I think Biden has many years of experience. He knows a lot of the world leaders. What he's done on the Paris Accord is just the first example of us getting re-engaged. So I tend to be optimistic. It's not going to be smooth sailing by any means, but I think we're back on the right path.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Frank. I find troubling the idea of hegemony because I think it historically countries are exhausted at some point, and that's what happens to virtually every empire. Sooner or later, they exhaust themselves. However, and having said that, what I think we've seen for a while is maybe we're off the stage. America has been off the stage. And the world, while not necessarily needing or having to depend on any one country, I think that there is a hunger again for leadership.
And I think that we're leading towards a little bit more humane relationships with people than we've experienced over the past few years. So I think that's going to be a trend with people who have been in this country, who came in, and the dreamers, and in this country with people being separated from children. I think there's going to be a turn and a change there.
And just to bounce off of that, another question that just came in from our audience. When it comes to addressing a very complicated or intracted conflict, how do you draw the theory of change?
That's a pretty broad, general question. So it depends on what type of intractability there is. And it's not something that can necessarily be directly solved, but it can be figured out before destroying all parties involved and around, that maybe there's a way to get past that in some sense, to be able to function even with a conflict between people.
And just to build off of that, what major elements in negotiation do you take into consideration when you go into a deal? And this is open to all panelists.
Well, I would say the elements you go into are understanding the objectives and understanding what the person across the table is willing to do and not willing to do. It's as much understanding the other side as it is, as a lawyer, is understanding your own client. You can't go into a negotiation and really expect to come up with a fruitful result if you don't pay any attention at all to the other person across the table. So a lot of it is just human understanding the nature of communication, understanding what's doable and what's not doable. Again, it goes back to what we said earlier about preparation and what Michael said about understanding the contours of negotiation. It's basic common sense, but you'd be surprised how people lose sight of that in the heat of a negotiation.
Yeah, and Beth, you were talking earlier about consciousness, so self-awareness. I would add to that the distinction between high IQ and high EQ, or appropriate combination of the two, right? So I know super intelligent people. I'm in every room. I'm not the smartest guy. I know that much. That much I have learned over the 30 years that I've been in business, that I am never the smartest person in the room. But I make it my quest to try to be at least or among the most aware in the room, to pay attention to the dynamic, and not just the language dynamic, but as you pointed out, some of the more subtle cues. This is particularly true when we move across international lines, where the cultural distinctions become very critical, and the assumption I might make, being a Jersey boy, just isn't going to play out very well if I'm in Singapore or South Africa, Boston or Bogota, and so I think we have to be aware, self-aware, and that degree of emotional quotient is as important as any other form of preparation, that we go into these negotiations awake and aware.
Yeah, and building on what both of you have said, which I love, is also the concept of BATNA, which so many people know, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this also speaks a little bit to the intractable conflict you mentioned before, Ardita. So it's really, what is the risk if we don't come to some kind of an agreement? What's at stake? Now, if it's not that big a deal, then you don't have to. You can ask for everything you want in the world and you can walk away and it's fine. But if that negotiation is a big deal because of the ripple effect and the repercussions that'll happen after that, then you have to figure out a way to make it work in that negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree, and I'd say it goes back to the notion you raised earlier of reputation. Because if you're an advisor and you develop the reputation of someone who promises a lot and can't deliver, that's not a good thing. It's not a good ticket for your future. So in a city like Washington, I'm sure New York and London, when you're there for a while, reputation is everything, and you can't take anything for granted.
And just to build off a previous conversation that we were having earlier between Beth, Michael, and Frank, what are some long-term impacts that COVID-19 has had on consumer spending habits, and where do you see or foresee these spending habits being allocated towards?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the digital age had already begun the process for reimagining the consumer markets. We were starting to come to a conclusion that I don't necessarily have to go to a store to find or purchase the thing. So by that very fact, the question would be asked, why would I go at all? Well, a good example for me was I wanted to buy a brand new flat panel TV, and there's plenty of them out there, and I can go online and make that purchase decision and have that technology delivered to my doorstep. But I'm spending a few bucks on this thing, and I want to look at the aesthetics, and I want to understand why having one this big or that small would make a difference. What are the varying degrees of the optics, if you will? How many pixels am I going to get, and why is that important? And yeah, I could do tons of research, but I really wanted to get advice. So I went to a Best Buy, which has a reputation for really great technical know-how. So I wasn't just buying the hardware. I was buying knowledge and expertise. And I was also presumably going to be standing across or sitting down with a person who was affable and interested, who was going to ask a few questions. Well, Michael, what room is this going to go in? How much television do you watch? Do you have kids? Do you have people over? Do you watch the ball game or the symphony? What's this thing going to do for you? And so the point is that in a digital sphere, I have choices. And if I'm going to go and interact with somebody today, if I'm going to go into a store, the experience of buying, the experience, the the desire for knowledge and wisdom, if you will either be imparted or not. And my going to that store, again, will result from that experience, positive or not. And that's something that you're not going to get, by the way, on the internet. I'll shop for commodities on the internet, but when I want to shop for something that's really important on another level, either it's going to cost me a lot more money or it has implications for the long term, I'm probably going to want to go in and talk to a functional expert who can help me sort out between the various options at my disposal.
Something that's come up also is the whole digital divide has really become more amplified. So just because we say, okay, everybody stay home, so children stay home and do your schooling at home, and families stay home and do your work at home. Some people like, great, you know, or okay, fine, I'm only missing my socialization, I'm not missing other things. And for a whole lot of other people around the world and right next door to us, there are people who have very small living spaces with many people in them, and maybe they don't have the electronic equipment that they need to even access the internet, or maybe they have one computer or one tablet that's going to give everybody access. You have the kids wanting to be doing their schoolwork, and you have mom and dad, each with their own businesses and companies and so on. So I think that we as a society need to really think more about what does that mean with internet access. Even there are places you get Wi-Fi and there are places that it's not accessible unless you pay for it. What does that mean? So I think companies, organizations, government, everybody's going to have to really think seriously about what do we do for our whole society, because if we don't all move forward, then we don't all move forward. And we have to think about that in terms of the digital divide. And COVID has really amplified that a lot.
I would agree with that completely, Beth.
Yeah, I really feel for Beth and the whole education industry, because to me, that seems like the one sector that is really getting slammed. How do you educate a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old or a college student with the COVID shutdown? I mean, it's fine for businesses, I think, adapt a bit. We don't like Zoom meetings, but we deal with them and they can accomplish things. But I think the whole education area is one that my heart goes out to, because I think it is such an incredible challenge. There's no playbook you can go by, and you just have to do the best you can in terms of what's doable face-to-face and what's not, and what's the best policy given the health considerations.
I think in the universities in general, we've had an easier, in quotes, easier go than the elementary schools and the younger grades, because we've been doing online learning, at least in our program, we've been doing online learning. We're pretty advanced in that sense, but there's still a lot of things we had to think about, such as how do you simulate experiential role plays on Zoom? You know, how do you get people to really develop the skills that we're talking about? It's not just the book knowledge, which stays up here, but how do you get them to really embody the skills? So those are our challenges. But the younger kids who really need the different kinds of socialization that happens when you figure out how to play together in the sandbox, that's the kind of stuff that's really tough, I think, too. And if you're a working mom and dad at home with your kids and you have your work to do, and then you have to help your kid on the school, you know, assignment as well, I don't know how they do it. My kids are already out of the house. I don't know how the little people with little kids do it.
Thank you very much for these answers. One question that I got was also, can you give a specific recent example when integrative tactics were more successful in a situation that might have previously been approached in a distributive way? And again, that question is open to all the panelists. And I will say that it's my co-president, Josh, that asked this, and that really wants an answer as well. So
can you repeat the question again?
Yes. So can you give a specific example, recent example, when integrative tactics were more successful in a situation that might have previously been approached in a distributive way?
Well, I think from my client's perspective, the strategy of dealing with these added tariffs is one that it kind of forces you to take an integrated approach, because every time you make one move with respect to, say, China, it has an effect on what we're doing with Europe. It has an effect worldwide on sourcing. So my recent example has been guiding clients through If there are 4 things that are bothering you now in terms of trade impediments, what's the most important? Because we may have to abandon 1 or 2 others to get to that situation. So I've done it in the context of what are called the Section 301 parts of the trade wars. And that's where you really have to take a holistic, integrated approach to how you best serve this client, explaining to them that you're going to have some trade-offs because not everything is doable in one fell swoop.
Well, I work in a distributed environment, a global entity in multiple time zones. I also work in an organization vastly complicated by the different things that we do. There are engineers, programmers, if you will. There are marketeers. There are, brand stewards. There are salespeople. There's general management. There's legal. And I have to transit between constituents. And when we talk about negotiation, we sometimes talk about it as an extra outside of my organization, but what we have to do on our own ecosystems. How do we negotiate for budget? How do I negotiate for time? How do I negotiate for other resources, human capital, and so forth? And so, when we were meeting in an office, it was a little bit easier because I could sit down in a room and we could sort it all out or argue our case. Now, we do that in Zoom, which is obviously a bit exhausting after a day of these, right? So I have to write things out. I have to think them out a little bit more, and I have to be more patient with others and myself that how I communicate my needs has to also be effectively your needs. Otherwise, I'm not going to get what I want. So I have to find need states that are codependent and work towards a request with not just what I need or want, and the hell with it if I don't get it, but how does this serve, how does my requirement support the structure of your department? And how can I help you? And therefore, how can we help each other get what we want? I think that that's more vital than ever. And for the next 6 to 12 months, I think it's going to be absolutely essential that, again, we be patient and explicit in our calls to action, on our requests, and that we realize that even if we don't get that instantaneously, that may have nothing to do with us and everything to do with them and the constraints that are on my opposite at that moment, and to be willing to come back later on, to let it go for a few minutes, to figure out that there may be a different way to make my argument, and again, to be patient with the process.
I think you both raised really good points that integrative negotiation takes an incredible amount of time and effort. But if you don't do it, then you're going to have to pick up the pieces at the end when you haven't used what you should. And the repercussions, and I was thinking when Frank was saying also about setting precedent, if you set a precedent here, then other people know about it, as secretive as you think you are. And then the repercussions all the way through, just as even like was Michael saying, inside of an organization, promising this person something, other people are going to know about it. So you really have to be equitable and think about everybody being transparent and really knowing and putting that effort in up front, because it really does pay off in the long run.
And my last question for today, before we close off, is we've talked about being generous in spirit, being involved, and mentorship. Do you have any additional tip for someone that is currently in grad school to advance in the field of negotiation?
Well, I think broadly speaking, a well-rounded person, a well-educated person who, as somebody had mentioned earlier, curiosity, never lose your sense of curiosity. Keep all of your interests going, whether it's in the, it doesn't have to be negotiation, the arts, sciences, natural world, whatever. I think a well-rounded person that understands people is going to be the best negotiator. It's not going to be a person who focuses solely on one discrete art, if you will, without being really a total human being. So there's a religious side to us, a literary side to us, an artistic side to that. All of that has to be matured and nurtured and grown over the years, particularly for a young person. So don't shut out your other interests. They make you a better person in the long run, and incidentally, they make you a better negotiator.
Mm-hmm. Well, Beth, unless I think you were just going to get to speak, I can wait. Or
no, please go ahead.
there's a phrase from a tech guy that you all know, and I don't use this because I happen to be in tech now. I grew up in the consumer products and retail sector, but I was moved by the book, by the title, "The Journey is the Reward," which comes from the story of Job's. And there's a lot of things that can be said about him retrospectively and about what Apple has become as a result of that. But that idea locked on for me a long time ago. And so if I were to say to anybody at any age, by the way, never forget that the journey is the reward, and that you may have money or power, you might have possession or wealth, you may have all the great things that everybody tells you you might or might not get in life. But along the way, smell the roses, as they say, take a deep breath, realize that what you have now isn't what you're going to end up with necessarily. I think, Frank, you had said at the very early stages, you didn't know that you were going to be the lawyer that you were going to become when you went to Washington. Well, none of us, Beth, Frank, or I, knew that we would be with all of you today 30 years ago. But here we are sharing our best selves, I think, I hope, and offering you something which comes from our experience. And you are on a path right now. So just take it all in, enjoy the ride, because there are going to be things that you can hardly imagine happening a year, 2, 5, 20 years from now. And all of that is at your doorstep already, whether you see it, know it, or perceive it.
Yeah, just one thing I was going to say is negotiation permeates every part of our life. So it's really the how we do it, but what's the what? So you still have to have a much fuller existence, a much fuller basis. Both of you have said learning and growing and continue, because no two negotiations are the same. So you are not the same person today that you were yesterday, and you won't be the same tomorrow, negotiating different things at different times for different needs. So you have to just continue to grow and learn as you go along the way.
Thank you, Michael, Beth, and Frank, for your diligence and willingness to answer some of these questions. I'm going to hand it off to Aya, as it does look like we are coming up to our time. Again, thank you so much to the audience and to the panelists for joining on.
Yes, I'll be very quick because I do know that you guys have to leave. But thank you very much for this incredibly insightful panel. It was an absolute pleasure to moderate, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Ardita as well, the three of you, and I really hope to have you again on the panel very soon. Yes, so have a good day. Michael, have a good night, and please stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now, everybody. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Ciao for now.